David, bevakasha.
Okay. Erev Tov from Jerusalem. As always, we thank Josh Schumann for organizing this event, and we thank our lecturers in advance, Professor David Frankel, Dr. Gila Bachman, Rabbi Matt Berkowitz. Needless to say, this Purim is different from other Purims because of the war that has been going on in Israel since October 7th. And I'm going to begin with the Dvar Torah, and lots of times when rabbis give Divrei Torah, they have to look very hard for parallels between something in the Bible and current events. Unfortunately, right now, we don't have to look very hard. And the Purim story stares us in the face. And to a certain extent, we think that we are reliving the story. We read in Kohelet chapter 1, Ein kol chadash tachat hashamesh, there is nothing new under the sun. And there's a famous rabbinic saying, Ma'aseh avot siman labanim, that like the destiny of the fathers is the destiny of the children. And interestingly enough, Mendel Amocher Svarim, the famous Yiddish Hebrew author 150 years ago, he added on a phrase. He said, Ma'aseh avot siman labanim, v'tocho echad hamakot v'hapegaim. He said that the destiny of the fathers is the destiny of the children, and it has one content or one message, the beatings and the afflictions. And Mendel Amocher Svarim, of course, lived in a time when Jews were afflicted in what was then Tsarist Russia. And finally, we have the famous French saying from 1849 by Jean-Baptiste Alphonse Carr, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And unfortunately, all I had to do was open up Megillat Esther to see a number of parallels to our current situation. Toward the beginning of the story, in chapter 3, verse 6, Haman decides on genocide, that he wants to destroy the Jewish people. ויבז בעיניו לשלוח יד במרדכי לבדו, כי הגידו לו את עם מרדכי, ויבקש המן להשמיד את כל היהודים אשר בכל מלכות אחשוורוש עם מרדכי. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordechai alone, having been told who Mordechai's people were. Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews, Mordechai's people, throughout the kingdom of Achashverosh. And a few verses later, in verse 13, V'nishloach sfarim v'yad haratzim, and written instructions were dispatched, El kom dinot hamelech, to all the kingdoms of the king, lashmid, larog, ulabed et kol haYehudim minar v'ad zaken taf anashim b'yom echad, to destroy, massacre, and exterminate all the Jews, young and old, children and women, on a single day, on the 13th day of the month of Adar. Unfortunately, the Hamas organization, terrorist organization, that is exactly what they want to do, and which is exactly what they tried to do on October 7th. And if they had had the wherewithal, and if the IDF had not reacted, they would have continued to do that on a large scale, because unfortunately their ideology is the ideology of Haman. And what ultimately was the Jewish reaction? The Jewish reaction is found in chapters 8 and 9 of Megillat Esther. Chapter 8, verse 11, Achashverosh gives the Jews permission to defend themselves. Asher natan hamelech haYehudim asher b'chol ir v'ir li'kaev v'la'amod al nafsham la'ashmid v'la'arog v'la'abed et kol chel am u'mdina tzarim otam taf v'nashim u'shlalam lavoz. The king has permitted the Jews of every city to assemble and fight for their lives. If any people or province attacks them, they may destroy, massacre, and exterminate its armed forces, together with women and children, and plunder their possessions, which was, of course, what was common. Please put yourselves on mute. Josh, אתה יכול לשים mute? Okay. So what was common at the time was that you not only killed your enemies, but their families as well. But the point of the story is that Achashverosh gave them permission to defend themselves. And we see in chapter 9 that that is exactly what the Jewish people did. And on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, when the king's command and decree were to be executed, the very day on which the enemies of Jews had expected to get them in their power, the opposite happened, and the Jews got their enemies in their power. And it goes on to say in verses 15 and 16 of chapter 9, ויקהלו היהודים אשר בשושן גם ביום 14 לחודש אדר, ויהרגו בשושן 300 איש, ובביזה לא שלחו את ידם. That in the city of Shushan, they also defended themselves on the 14th of Adar, and they slew 300 men in Shushan, but they did not lay their hands on the spoil. And furthermore, in the next verse, the rest of the Jews, those in the king's provinces, likewise mustered and fought for their lives. They disposed of their enemies, killing 75,000 of their foes, but they did not lay hands on the spoil. And the emphasis of the story is that they were physically defending themselves against their enemies. Their enemies had intended to kill them. They killed their enemies in return, but they did not lay their hands on the spoil. Uva biza lo shalhu et yadam. There was absolutely no desire to take spoils, which was so common in ancient wars, but simply a war of self-defense. And of course, that is exactly what the state of Israel has been doing since October 7th. But perhaps the irony is that in the book of Esther, the Jews need to get permission from Achashverosh in order to defend themselves. Unfortunately, there are many countries in the world that think that we need their permission to defend ourselves. We do not need their permission. Self-defense is a basic right of any people, and we have the famous Talmudic principle, Haba lahorgecha hashkem lahorgo, a person who comes to kill you, rise up and kill him first in an act of self-defense. And I was born in and raised in Arlington, Virginia. I made Aliyah 51 years ago. But if there were 30,000 terrorists in Arlington and Alexandria, Virginia, I can assure you the United States government would not ask anyone's permission in order to kill those terrorists. Yeah, they would simply do what needs to be done in order to defend innocent civilians. And therefore, Maaseh Avot Siman Levanim, on the one hand, we have the Hamas organization, which wants to destroy us. On the other hand, we have the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, that are doing everything they can to defend the Jewish people, not taking any spoils, and doing everything they can not to harm civilians. And finally, we have a phrase that appears twice in Megillat Esther, in chapter 9. First, it says, Ve'nafochu, and the tide was reversed, the situation was reversed, that the Jews were killing their enemies. And finally, in verse 22, it says, if I can page through my Tanakh here, it says, Kayamim asher nachu bahem hayudim me'ovehem ve'achodesh asher ne'epach lahem mi'agon lesimcha u'me'evel liyom tov la'asot otam yemei mishteh v'simcha. The same days in which the Jews enjoyed relief from their foes, and the same month which had been transformed for them, right? Ne'epach lahem, from one of grief and mourning to one of festive joy, and to days of feasting and merriment. We hope and pray that these difficult days, which have faced us since October 7th, will soon, yafru lanu, will turn for us into days of joy and gladness. Amen. And we will be able to truly rejoice in the return of the hostages and in the defeat of our foes, and have a little bit of peace here in Eretz Israel. Amen. So we hope and pray that the victory of the Jews against Haman will be repeated in our day. And without further ado, we will now segue into our shiurim. The first is with Professor David Frankel, Associate Professor of Bible at Machon Schechter, the Schechter Institute. And his talk is called Before Purim, the Original Form of the Esther Story. David, bevakasha.
Thank you very much. And we all, I think, share in your prayers that victory and relief and revach and hatzalah will come to us speedily in our day.
Amen.
I would like to study the book of Esther from a somewhat archaeological perspective, so to speak. And what I mean by archaeological is not looking at digging up some kind of stones or mounds of ground and unearthing actual artifacts in order to enlighten the Book of Esther, but to sort of like dig into the book itself in order to perhaps retrieve what scholars believe is a possible earlier version of the Esther story. And it's in the amount of time that we have, I will not be able to do this in any great depth, but I want to at least introduce you to the concept of this unearthing of an earlier version of the Esther story. So first, allow me to present the somewhat radical thesis, certainly radical for people who haven't heard of it or been exposed to it. And the thesis basically is that the Book of Esther, as we have it, combines two elements or two things that originally were separate and perhaps even had nothing to do with each other. The one element is the story, and the other element is the holiday. Clearly, the way the Esther story appears today, and the way we know it, and the way we celebrate Purim, is based on the integral connection between the story and the holiday. The holiday commemorates the story explains where this holiday comes from. So the story could almost be explained as what's known as an etiology for the holiday. In other words, it is a story that comes to explain when this holiday was established, why it was established, and why we continue to celebrate this holiday called Purim. And the answer is the story. The story explains the holiday. However, it is not unusual to find that holidays and stories sometimes are not an inherent fit, and that sometimes the wedding of these two elements can be the product of a later act of editing. And so I want to give at least a little bit of background in order to make this thesis sound more reasonable than it might sound at first hearing. And perhaps if we have time, talk about what that early pre-Purim Esther story might have looked like. Okay? So, Joshua, can you first put up the texts about the Book of Jubilees? Okay, there we go. Here we have
Josh, please make it bigger if you can.
Josh, down here at the bottom right, you can make it bigger, I think.
Ah.
That's a little too big.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here I have two examples of something that we find often in the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees is a book that is considered to be one of the Sfarim Chitzoniyim, one of the apocryphal books that didn't make it into the Bible, but it was extremely popular in Second Temple times. A lot of copies of it were found in among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what is the Book of Jubilees? It is basically a rewriting of the book of Genesis. It says it's like its own version of the book of Genesis, but it's a retelling with lots of unique elements that are not found in our standard version of the book of Genesis. So one of the things that's really interesting that the book of Jubilees does is basically kind of like as a precursor to what Chazal said. We all know that the rabbi said, that the patriarchs kept the whole Torah. The Abraham kept the whole Torah, and Isaac and Jacob, and it's a well-known midrashic theme. And there's a joke about that perhaps some of you may know, that one rabbi supposedly said that even Abraham even wore a kippah. And then they ask, well, where does it say that? And the answer is that, well, according to Jewish law or custom, you're not supposed to walk Daled Amot, you're not supposed to walk 4 cubits without a kippah on. And it says, Vayelech Avraham, he walked, so he must have had a kippah. So that's the famous joke, but it reflects a certain, presentation of the patriarchs as being rabbinic-like figures. They must have kept the Torah. And the book of Jubilees goes even further. Not only did they keep the Torah, they basically founded many of its most important mitzvot. So, for example, Josh, can you lift up the page? I'm going to read the second text from Jubilees. And here it talks about the story of Joseph, famous story of Joseph. He's taken and thrown in the pit, and then the brothers see the caravan coming of Ishmaelites or Midianites or whatever, and they rip up the clothing, the famous Ketonet Pasim of Joseph. They slaughter a goat and dip the blood dip the Ketonet into this blood, and they show it to their father. They sell Joseph to Egypt, and they show it to their father, Jacob, and say, Taraf Yosef, Joseph has been eaten, or they allow him to conclude that Joseph has been ripped up by, a terrible lion or whatever. Famous story in the book of Genesis. Here's the way Jubilees retells it. And the sons of Jacob slaughtered a kid and dipped the coat of Joseph in the blood and sent it to Jacob their father on the 10th of the 7th month. Okay, this is very important. That's not written in Genesis. When did this happen, this dipping of the blood in the goat, dipping of the ketonet in the goat's blood? What is the 10th of the 7th? It's Yom Kippur.
Yom Kippur.
Yom Kippur. This is happening on Yom Kippur. And he mourned, Jacob mourned all that night, for they had brought it to him in the evening. Now, it's very important for Jubilees to say, when did they bring him the coat of many colors? In the evening, the night before, actually, the 10th. Or why? Because Yom Kippur starts at night. So Yom Kippur, so the prefiguring of Yom Kippur in the Joseph story has to also happen in the evening of the 10th. Jacob becomes feverish with mourning for Joseph's death, and he says, an evil beast has devoured Joseph, and all the members of his house mourned with him that day, and they were grieving and mourning for him all that day being the next day. For this reason, it is ordained for the children of Israel that they should afflict themselves on the 10th of the 7th month, on the day that the news which made him weep for Joseph came to Jacob his father, that they should make atonement for themselves thereon with a young goat on the 10th of the 7th month, once a year for their sins. In other words, why do we have the famous Sa'ir La'azazel on Yom Kippur? Because in memory of the first primal sin of the Jewish people against their own brethren. And it was basically determined from that moment in the time of Joseph. And that is what established Yom Kippur. Later, the Jews celebrate it, but it's basically in commemoration of this event in the patriarchal period. This is one of many, many examples. The other one, which I'm not going to read with you, but on the top of the page, which we're not going to read, is basically the story, the famous story of the Akedah. And what happens in the Akedah, we all know. Isaac is nearly slaughtered. To make a long story short, in the retelling of Jubilees, a date is added to exactly when Isaac is nearly slaughtered. And perhaps you can guess when that near slaughter of Isaac takes place. Yes, you guessed it. It is on Pesach. And because on Pesach, Isaac was, so to speak, slaughtered, we today or commemorate the similar Korban Pesach, and it's not only in commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt, it's also, and even more primarily, in commemoration of the much earlier, more fundamental event of the Akedat Yitzchak. Why am I bringing these? And there are many other examples in the book of Jubilees. I'm bringing this because it shows a certain phenomenon. The phenomenon is to take a story that's just a story that may have all sorts of other messages, but to give it a date, and by giving it a date, to then turn the story into an explanation and a foundation for a holiday with which the story originally had nothing to do, and the holiday had nothing to do with the story. In other words, what Jubilees does is exactly what I am claiming and others claim happens perhaps in the book of Esther. A story is taken and it is interpreted as the foundation for a holiday. And what's really amazing about this phenomenon is that it appears all over the world. In other words, this idea of taking stories and reinterpreting them to justify or give foundation for either holidays or rituals or other types of celebration. So that's the first stage of the thesis. The next step that I'd like to follow is Josh is from a different version of the story of Esther. Okay, this is there are just as there are story as there is the Hebrew version of the Esther story that we know. There is also a longer version of the Esther story that appears in the Septuagint, in the Greek version of the Tanakh. And in this version, there are all sorts of additions. We'll read perhaps one of them is the prayer of Queen Esther. And what I
Josh, if you could enlarge it just a bit.
Josh?
Okay, go ahead, David.
Okay. The one thing I want to emphasize here, if you'll see, it says the heading is Addition C. In other words, it's one of the additions that we have in the book of, compared to the Hebrew book of Esther. It's called an addition because it's not what we have in the Hebrew. But what's important to emphasize is that only
Excellent,
to
Josh.
us is this text that we're going to read an addition. Because this edition, like many of the other editions, is basically a translation of a Hebrew book of Esther. And this version of the Hebrew book of Esther had these prayers that we're going to read as an integral part of their text. So it's true, it's added if we compare it to our Hebrew, but as far as this, the version that it reflects, it is the book of Esther, as known first in Jerusalem and then sent and translated to Alexandria. Okay? I'm going to read just a little bit of it. Queen Esther was terrified and sought refuge in the Lord. She took off her stately robes and put on clothes appropriate for distress and mourning, and instead of extravagant perfumes, she covered her head with ashes and dung. I'm skipping a little. Then she prayed to the Lord God of Israel and said, "My Lord, only you are king. Help me who am alone and have no helper except you, for I am risking my life. All my life I have heard in my family's tribe that you, Lord, chose Israel from all the nations and our fathers from all their predecessors for a perpetual inheritance, and you treated them just as you had promised. But now we have sinned against you, and you have handed us over to our enemies because we extolled their gods. You were in the right, Lord," etc., etc. What we have here is very clear. It is basically a way of turning the Megillah, the story of Esther, from a secular-like story where God is never mentioned into a biblical story where we have turning to God, prayer, humility, repentance, all the things that we would expect to find in a biblical story. And what we see, therefore, is that the book of Esther was not a frozen object. It was always growing, and it was expanding, and people were adding to it. And this is something that is very common of biblical books in Second Temple times. My favorite example, just it's a bit of an aside of this, is Shirat Miriam.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but there is a version of the book of Exodus in Qumran, which is the book of Exodus. It's not like the book of Jubilees, some retelling or something like that. It's the book of Exodus. But when it gets to Az Yashir, the song of the sea, and it quotes Az Yashir Moshe, and it quotes our famous song of the sea, afterwards, it puts an entire song into the mouth of Miriam. So whereas our Exodus has, one line that Miriam says, in this version of Exodus in Qumran, unfortunately, it's very fragmented, but there's a whole song that they attribute to Miriam in their Exodus. It wasn't called the addition, that was their Shmot. And one might ask, and many people do ask, like, well, how could they do that? How could, you can't just make up a song, put it into the Torah? How do you do that? And the answer is, as Obama used to say, yes, I can. Yes, they can. They just felt that Miriam's got to have said more than one little line, and they feel the freedom to supply Shirat Miriam. And that becomes part of their book of Shmot. And this is what happens with the book of Esther. This is the book of Esther. They used to say, verteucht and
No, verbessert and verteidigt.
verbessert and verteucht. And it improved and it translated and improved. That is what is in the nature of biblical stories and biblical texts. They grow, they never stay static. Just to read another section from this.
Okay, David, you have 5 minutes, okay?
Okay. From this text, the last thing that is put in her mouth. No. Go up, Josh. You know everything. Just by verse 26. You know everything, so you know that I hate the pomp of the wicked. This is Esther speaking. And I loathe the bed of the uncircumcised and of any foreigner. What is this? What is this doing? Obviously, she's sleeping with the king, a goy. At least she can say in her prayer, ichs fix, I hate it. He's a foreigner. You know my duty that I loathe, that symbol of my exalted position which is on my head. In other words, I hate my crown. When I appear in it at court, I loathe it like a menstruous rag. I do not wear it when I'm not at court. Your maidservant has not dined at Haman's table, nor have I extolled a royal party, nor drunk the wine of libations. I've only drank Kedem wine, pure kosher. From the day I have arrived here until now, your maidservant has not delighted in anything except you, Lord God of Abraham, God who might prevail, whose might prevails over all. Hear the voice of the despairing and save us from the hands of the wicked. And Lord, protect me from my fears. Okay, so the point that I'm trying to make, unfortunately, I have less than 5 minutes left. The point I'm trying to make is that the book of Esther grows with time. And we see it growing larger than our Purim text, than our Esther text, but we can therefore assume that it also grew before it arrived at the state that it is now in the Hebrew version that we are aware of. Okay? It's a continuous process of growth, kind of like a snowball going down a mountain. As time goes, the ball gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I believe, and here I can't expound too much, but I believe that the original story of Esther ended basically with the hanging of Haman and the coming out of Mordecai in royal attire. And it says then, what happens at that point? V'ha'ir Shushan
צהלה ושמחה.
צהלה ושמחה, ליהודים הייתה אורה, שמחה וששון ויקר. End of story. It was the story in which the Jews were saved by the hanging of Haman and the replacement of Haman by the great Jewish leader Mordechai. And that was it. Everybody was happy. End of story. Imagine if we could now go home after hearing the Megillah at the end of chapter 8, just there, we wouldn't have to listen through all the rest of that stuff when everybody is making noise and jumpy and want to go home already.
Thank you. Thank you. And on that note, David.
And on that note, I want to wish us all a happy Purim, and perhaps we can find a little happiness also in the fact that once the story did not have to end with all the blood and gore, and we could just kill one enemy, and that would bring us sufficient salvation.
Halvai. Thank you
Halavai.
very much, David. Yishar kochacha.
Thank
David,
you.
is there one article or book that summarizes this thesis about the, if you could perhaps write it in the chat or send it to Josh and he'll send it out.
I will do that.
And someone asked whether there is a recording. Yes, we are recording these and the recordings will be sent out in the near future. Toda rabah, David. Yishar kochacha. I would just like to say what's so interesting to me as a rabbinic scholar about your talk is that the same thing happens to medieval halachic works. They were constantly farbesed and fartaich. People were constantly added to them. There are a number of different versions of Sefer Hasidim because Sefer Hasidim from the 13th century kept growing. They kept adding on more and more material. So you're basically saying that the same thing happened to some of the biblical books in the Second Temple period. Very interesting.
Thank you.
We segue to our next talk with Dr. Gila Wachman, the Book of Esther Through the Eyes of the Rabbis, and we thank Gila very much. She had laryngitis over the weekend, and we weren't sure that she could teach, but she was nice enough to agree to teach. So we're letting her get away with just 20 minutes because we don't want to kill her voice. So Gila is a lecturer in Midrash at Schechter. Bevakasha, Gila.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for my voice today, which is not in its best. Okay, so our learning today will focus on the Midrash, on the book of Esther, as it appears in the tractate Megillah in the Babylonian Talmud. And this is quite an unusual phenomenon, since we have about 7 or 8 full pages. Perhaps there's only one more place in the Talmud that offers us some kind of a unit, a very long unit of Midrash on a single book. The other case, I believe, is in Bava Batra about the book of Job, Eov. And as Professor Franco just mentioned, it's a well-known fact that the sages tend to portray the biblical characters in their own image, so to speak, right? He said the patriarchs are as rabbinical figures, right? Keeping kosher and going to yeshiva and everything. So what I want to do today in the time that I have and whatever my throat would let me do is to show a few examples to this phenomenon. Now, we should emphasize that this phenomenon of portraying biblical figures, and of course we will focus on Mordechai and Esther and others, it's not due to a lack of imagination, nor is it a matter of some kind of narrow-minded perspective bending the story to their own ideology, like we won't let Avraham not wear a kippah because that's the way we think a Jewish person should do. I think we should think about the purpose. The purpose is to make the biblical story and the biblical figures an educational model and a relevant idea for our time, for contemporary problems and times, and something we can learn from, something we can relate to, and maybe even draw comfort from. So we will read a few examples, and not as many as I thought I will. Sorry. Just I'll share the PowerPoint that I made here. So we'll just look through a few examples out of many, because all these 7 or 8 pages of the Talmud are full of examples of rabbinic retelling of the story of Megillat Esther. So we'll start with one midrash that appears, very famous one. It appears not in the big chunk of midrash that I mentioned before, these 7 or 8. It appears earlier in the Masechet, and it says that Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yehuda said, Esther sent the sages, establish me for generations, kiv'uni ledorot. They sent to her, you arouse the wrath of the nations upon us. She sent to them, I am already written in the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. This is the first thing Esther sends to, the first of 2. What does it mean, kiv'uni ledorot, establish me for generations? So kiv'uni is really not me, the person, Esther, but the celebration, the holiday. Of course, this goes way after the process that Professor Frenkel described before. So we should notice, first of all, Esther needs the authority of the rabbis. She sends to the sages a message and asks for a permission to become a holiday. And they refuse. They would not want this to happen because it's not a nice thing to do, to rag around with your the victory that you had. But he says, well, forget about that. That's already written. That's not a new thing. We're not revealing any secret here. Just want to be a holiday that mentions that celebrates this victory. And then the second thing Esther sent to the sages is write me for future generations. Kitvuni besefer, right? In a book. So first, as we see here, first we have the holiday, and then, according to this midrash, comes the story. And they sent back to her, this is a verse in Proverbs, in Mishlei, have I not written for you 3 times? Halo katavti lecha shalishim. So shalishim here is understood as 3 times. So the story about Haman, basically the story about Amalek, should be written 3 times and not 4 times. And Esther is already the 4th, after the other stories in Exodus and Shmot about Amalek, and in Deuteronomy and in Dvarim, Timche et Zecher Amalek, what we are about to read this Shabbat. And then there's a story about Agag and Shmuel. So that's 3 times of fighting against Amalek, and you're the 4th, and it doesn't say that you should have a 4th time. Until they found a verse in the Torah, write this for a memorial in the book. Tov zot zikaron b'sefer. This is actually a verse after the first mentioning of the fight against Amalek. So they did find a verse in the Torah. This is very important that the verse is in the Torah, not in Ketuvim and Mishlei. And so the way this verse is interpreted is write this, that which is written in the Torah, here and in Deuteronomy. The 2 times are considered as one. In a memorial, that which is written in the prophets. In the book, that which is written in the Megillah, which is a book which is the part of Ketuvim. So 3 times are Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, and we found a way of getting out with this thing of a new story about Amalek to be written. Now, what does this midrash really try to tell us? I think that the sages here are dealing with an issue that troubled them at their time, and that's the authority to add mitzvot and add holidays, and probably even add the book of Esther to the canon, to to the Bible, to the Tanakh. And I believe many of you probably know that the question of including Esther as part of the Tanakh was still in the air for a long time. Actually, speaking of the scrolls of Qumran, as far as I know, there weren't found any evidence of the book of Esther among those scrolls. And it could be a coincidence, but it could also be some kind of an evidence that this book was in a question. It wasn't. They weren't so sure about including it. So what the sages are really doing here is trying to put their own dilemma. First of all, adding a new holiday to the Jewish calendar, which Purim is actually the first holiday. Hanukkah would come later, and in our days we can talk about Yom Ha'atzmaut or other special days. But this is a problem. How do we add a new holiday to the list? And also, how do we add a new book to the Bible? So they put it in the mouth of Esther, but I think we really hear the sages speaking here and dealing with this problem and getting the authority, getting the okay do so. And this is why it's most important that it comes from the Torah, because the whole idea of mitzvot derabanan and mitzvot deoraita, and there's some kind of a hierarchy, right? But in this case, it's a verse from Shemot that lets them do so, that gives them the permission to write this zikaron b'sefer, to write this new story that was not part of the Bible before. But as I said, this is like sort of a beginning or an entrance to the whole idea. This is not part of the whole midrash. It's sort of a later notion of this idea. When we go into the story itself, and I'm going to do just a few short examples for this because it's too much for my throat already. So we'll take one story from the first chapter of Esther, and this appears at Megillah Daf Yud Bet Amud Bet. About the verse, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. This is actually the first banquet, the first mishteh, where the whole story, which started the whole story, the event that started it all. So the heart of the king was merry with wine. So the sages asked, is that say that until now his heart was not merry with wine? Why just on the seventh day? And Rava said the seventh day was Shabbat. When the sages see seventh day, it's always Shabbat, in other places as well. And what's so special about Shabbat? When the Jewish people eat and drink, they begin with words of Torah and words of praise. But the nations of the world, when they eat and drink, they begin only with words of licentiousness. So too, at the feast of that wicked man, meaning Achashverosh, some said, the Median women are the most beautiful, while others said the Persian women are the most beautiful. And Achashverosh said to them, the vessel that I use is neither Median nor Persian, but Chaldean, because this is a tradition, a Midrashic tradition, that Vashti was a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. I don't remember if his daughter or granddaughter, but she came from that country. And then he asked, do you wish to see her? They said to him, yes, provided that she be naked. And the whole idea of bringing her naked on the seventh day is really a proof of justice, for it is with the measure that a man measures that he himself is measured. This teaches that the wicked Vashti would take the daughters of Israel and strip them naked and make them work on Shabbat. As it is written, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. What she had done, meaning not what she had done refusing to come, but what she had done that caused her to be punished. Just as she had done, so it was decreed upon her. Okay, so when we look at this story, this retelling of the biblical story, or of the story of Esther, and specifically Vashti, I think they put Vashti as a typical anti-Semitic ruler. She knows what Shabbat is. She knows that Jewish people do not work on Shabbat and how painful it would be for them, and not to mention the fact that she stripped them naked. So we see her now not as just the queen of Achashverosh who was dismissed, but also as a typical anti-Semitic ruler, eventually being punished as she deserves. So this gives us, the listeners, or us, the learners, an event to relate to as part of Jewish history. Here comes the evil queen and gets what she deserves. Maybe I'll give another example. And when you look at the relationship between Mordechai and Esther, and so this midrash in the Bavli sees Esther as not only as Mordechai's niece, but also, well, she's not his niece, she's his cousin. But not only did he take her as a daughter, he took her as a wife. They read the verse. When her father and mother were dead, Mordechai took her for his own daughter, but the word daughter is learned not as bat, but as bai, or a home. And following this, when the next verse says, "Ve'et ma'amar Mordechai Esther otza," for Esther adhered to the words of Mordechai, Rabbi Yirmiyah said, this teaches us that she would show this charge of her menstrual blood to the sages. She keeps halacha. She needs the authority of the rabbis, and she shows them the blood to see if she's pure or impure. And then what's mostly amazing is the verse "Ka'asher hayta be'omna ito," the agreement between Esther and Mordechai, as she was brought up with him. Rabba Bar Lima said she would arise from the lap of Achashverosh, immerse herself, and sit in the lap of Mordechai. Of course, sitting in the lap is a nicer way of saying it, but she was sort of married to both. One of them was the Jewish way, and the other one was she was forced to do. And that's why later on, also there's a nice midrash here that I'm going to skip about her 7 maids that helped her count the 7 days of the week and keep Shabbat, of course. But when it gets to the point when he calls Mordechai and tells him, Lech knos et kol haYehudim, go gather together all the Jews, and so will I go in the king, not according to the custom, asher lo kadat. The way they explain this sentence, it will not be according to my usual custom, for every day until now, it was under compulsion, but now of my own free will. This time she's going to go to Achashverosh to give herself the way she wasn't supposed to do. And again, I think this gives a model of, unfortunately, stories that we know from during our painful history as the Jewish people. And that's why when she goes to Achashverosh and she stands in the inner court of the king's house, the Midrash puts in her mouth the verses from Psalms 22. And if any of you were here a year ago, I gave this shiur about the Midrash on Psalms 22. And so she says, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Perhaps it is because you judge an unintentional sin as one performed intentionally, and an action done due to circumstances beyond one's control as one done willingly. Of course, she is talking about herself and Achashverosh and the life that she is living not according to Jewish law. So these are just a few examples of a phenomenon that is well known, but I think is worth rethinking. Why are the sages telling these stories that sometimes make us even laugh about the biblical figures that obviously did not keep Tariag mitzvot the way the sages do it? But I do think that by doing this and by sharing their own thoughts, their own way of life, and their own dilemmas, they're making this story, this ancient story about Esther and Mordechai, they're making it closer to their world, and I think by this also making it closer to our world. And I also want to join the wishes that we heard before, and that whatever happens, that הימים אשר נהפכו מיגון לשמחה, that this will also happen to us, and these terrible days will end up to the good side, and we will hear good news, Bezrat Hashem, soon.
Amen. Thank you, Dr. Gila Bachman, especially for teaching when you have laryngitis. Kol hakavod. I just want to say that the Charedim do to Chazal what Chazal did to the figures in the Bible. I have here Mishnayot Meirot that I used to learn Mishnah with my children when they were young a long time ago. And here, for example, we have a picture. It says in the Mishnah in Sukkah about the Imzog Kosla Rabo, and the picture of the master and the slave are two men dressed in Haredi clothing. The Haredim do to Chazal what Chazal did to the rabbis, to the figures of the Bible. Todar Rabba Gila, we now segue to our last shiur this afternoon or evening. Illuminated Scrolls of Esther Through the Ages with Rabbi Matt Berkowitz, who became the vice president of the Schechter Institutes Incorporated in July. Little did we know what was coming in October, and we thank Matt very much for raising quite a bit of money for our 7 emergency projects of Schechter, which we have been running since the war began. Rabbi Matt is also an accomplished artist in addition to being a rabbi. So when he talks about art, he actually knows what he's talking about. Matt, bevakasha.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Galinkin, president of Schechter Institutes. I so appreciate the very wonderful and gracious introduction. And I want to say Yashar Kochechem to my dear colleagues at Schechter Institutes, Gila Bachman and David Frankel, for their exceptional teaching over the past hour. Shavua Tov. Over the course of the past hour that we've been learning together, we've delved into biblical and midrashic interpretations of the Scroll of Esther. And what I want to do now is I want to move us from the realm of text to the realm of art, and specifically the illumination of Megillat Esther, the illumination of the Scroll of Esther throughout the ages. It's appropriate to begin by defining the terms illumination and Megillah and scroll. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share screen and bring up my PowerPoint presentation that I've put together for us. Excellent. Okay, so in terms of definition of our terms, illumination, what do we mean by the illumination of Megillat Esther, of the Scroll of Esther? In terms of definitions of illuminate, we have 1, to light up, 2, to make understandable, clarify, 3, to enlighten intellectually or spiritually, 4, to endow with splendor, celebrate, and 5, to adorn with ornamental designs, miniatures, or lettering in brilliant colors, etc. Items 1 through 3, I would say, overlap with the realm of exegesis or hermeneutics. That is, commentary through words, right? To light up, to make understandable, clarify, to enlighten intellectually or spiritually. 4 and 5 are particular and unique to the realm of the artistic dimension. And now, from illumination, let's turn to the scroll or Megillah. Okay, what do we mean by this term of Megillah, scroll, right? A scroll typically of parchment that often refers to Megillat Esther, right? Most famously, that is its most famous association when we hear the term Megillah. But Megillah may also refer to any one of what is known as the 5 scrolls, right? And a great quiz question, name the 5 scrolls, right? the 5 scrolls that we have in the tradition, each associated with another holiday over the course of the year. Shir Shirim, the Song of Songs, which is associated with Pesach. Megillat Ruth, the Scroll of Ruth, associated with Shavuot. Echa, or Lamentations, with Tisha B'Av. Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, with Sukkot. And finally, Megillat Esther, the Scroll of Esther, which is associated with Purim. Since Talmudic times, it's been customary to write the Book of Esther on parchment in the form of a scroll. And one of the earliest pictorial depictions that we have of the story of Esther actually goes back to the Duro-Europos synagogue. Okay, we're going back to Syria 244 CE. And Duro-Europos is really a treasure trove of visual midrash for us, right, in which we see the pictorial representation of a number of biblical stories, including the story of Esther, right? And here we have this very, very cool representation. Obviously, what is it that we see here? We see Haman, right, humiliated Haman, right, parading Mordechai on the white horse, right? And to the right, all the way to the right, we see Achashverosh enthroned, right, with his courtiers all around him. So this is one of the earliest representations that we have. Obviously not on a scroll, but rather a mural on a wall, right? There's our Haman in Duro-Europos. And then when it comes to the illumination of the scroll of Esther, one of, in many ways, what we have to do is go to Italy to see the most exquisite illuminations. Decoration and illumination of Esther scrolls reached its height during the 17th and 18th centuries in Italy and in other countries in Europe. The decorative programs that we see in Esther scrolls usually depict the story in great detail, going chronologically through the story of Esther, episode after episode. And the earliest extant illuminated Esther scrolls are from about the 16th century Italy. They were commissioned by well-to-do Italian Jews and often housed in cylindrical or polygonal cases that were made of copper, tin, silver, and even ivory. All right, let's take a look at this first specimen from 1675. Right, you look at this first panel of Megillat Esther, and it screams out Italy, right? You just look at the iconography that you see here, right, including the columns, right, the architectural design that we see. Also, you'll see the image of an angel-like being in the top right-hand corner. And then if you take a look at the cartouches that appear at the lower and upper end of this panel, what do we see? Right, a closer look, there's Achashverosh sitting on his throne, gazing at the women of the beauty pageant as he's about to choose his next queen. And at the top cartouche, right, we see the hands of the Kohen. Right, we often see a mixture of architectural motifs in addition to other religious motifs all throughout the illumination of Megillot Esther, right, as well as angels or putai, nude putai, as you see at the beginning of this Esther scroll. Right, another very important specimen that we see from Italy, 1700. Right, take a close look at this beautifully written and illuminated Megillat Esther. And of course, I want us to focus in on the top right in particular. Right, there again, we have Haman parading Mordechai through the streets. But what's so significant about this particular icon that we see in this Megillat Esther is if you look up at the roof of the residence there, you will see a resident of that building taking his bedpan and pouring it out onto Haman, who is parading Mordechai in the street below. Right, again, one of the running themes that we've had over the course of this hour is the theme of B'chol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo. In every generation, we're obligated to see ourselves, right? And what was done here is obviously the Jews of that time, 1700 Italy, right, saw themselves in the story of Esther. And so you see, right, the particular dress or costume of Italian Jews illuminated in these scrolls. Ancona, Lugo, 18th century, a very, very intricate, delicate paper cut design that we have here. You see this floral design along with angels as well as mythical beasts, along with a peacock at the bottom of this paper cut. Aryeh Leib ben Daniel of Guria, 1748. Guria was a region of Georgia. Very, very interesting scroll, which has resonance with a scroll that also came out of southern France. What is it that we see here? Right, we see a number of characters of the Megillah that are portrayed here, including the eunuchs that we see at the top. Right, here we have Zetar, Karkas, Karshana, and then to the right, over here, we have Zeresh, right, the wife of Haman. At the bottom, Kartush, we see written in what looks like Rashi script, Beit HaMalchut, right, the house of the kingdom. There is Achashverosh, King Achashverosh, extending his scepter, and Esther touching the other end of the scepter. From there, we go to Venice, Italy, 1745. Here we have Aseret B'nai Haman, the 10 sons of Haman. Of course, in the bottom cartouche, we have the hanging of the 10 sons of Haman. And then this example of Aaron Wolf Herlingen of Gewitsch, Moravia, from 1750, right? Take a look at these very, very colorful images, right? Now we're in the 9th chapter of the book of Esther. And if we take an even closer look, what do we see here? Right? We see the Jews battling their enemies, right? The Jews with these sort of flat hats on their heads, right? And there they are conquering the enemies, right? That were planning to do them harm, that were planning to fulfill the genocidal plans of Haman. But of course, v'nafochu, the tables are turned. Raphael Montalto, Amsterdam, 1686, right? These images, right? Although the writing itself is authentic writing of a scribe on parchment, what it is that we see around this particular Megillah, right, are images that were created on copper plates and impressed into the parchment.
Wow.
Right, you see how intricate all of these images are. Again, Aseret B'nai Haman, the 10 sons of Haman that are hanging once again in this image. And then, of course, Persian manuscripts from the 19th century. Right, you see the exquisite beauty of this particular manuscript, the floral design, the gold leaf that's added to the parchment itself, as well as the very, very intricate case that we see here, the bronze case, the engraving that we have on the bronze case, the images that we see later in the Megillah. Here we have King Achashverosh, right, with Esther. And even India, right, this particular image is circa 1900, right? Look at how playful, how colorful, how animated these particular images are. Achashverosh and his courtiers. Right? And of course, the beauty of all of these Megillot is that they are a mirror of the civilizations from which they come, right? In so many ways, that is the power of who we are as a people, that is the richness of who we are as a Jewish people, that we acculturate, right? Not assimilate, but acculturate. We take the best of the cultural world around us and we weave it into a particular Jewish context, right? I want to bring us toward the finish line of this presentation, and I want to turn to a modern French-Israeli artist by the name of Eliyahu Sidi, a resident of Jerusalem. He created his images of Megillat Esther in 2000. Eliyahu Sidi can best be described as a very animated and somewhat wacky textual artist, right? In this opening image of his Megillat Esther, he portrays an introduction to the Megillah on a classical deck of cards. And here we're introduced to all of the main characters of Megillat Esther. So Esther, who is crowned in the background, this blue image, and then going from left to right, we have King Achashverosh, who is portrayed as a foolish character, an idiot with a pot on his head and always in diapers. You'll see this as we go through the images of Sidi's Megillah. Haman, who is portrayed as a wolf, a multi-eyed wolf, very, very scary and threatening image. And then, of course, Mordechai, who is portrayed as this calm, wise character. Mordechai, by the way, has a striking resemblance to the artist himself, to Eliyahu Sidi. Okay, the banquet. Here we are. You could see how colorful. You could see this is classic Sidi style, right? To take, right, the text itself, literally to cut and paste the text and create these very, very wild and colorful images. You also see, as we go through the text, there's Achashverosh, right, with the bottle of wine in his hands. There he is. It looks almost as if he's being potty trained in the lower right-hand corner with a pot above and below. Right, there he is at the feast. Right, and he walks us through the entire Megillah, the beauty pageant. Right, Shisha Chodeshim b'Shemen Hamor, Shisha Chodeshim b'Vsamim. Right, the women appointing themselves in oil, cologne, cosmetics, perfumes, etc. Right, Max Factor, Gorle, you sense the humor of Eliyahu Sidi. Esther hides her identity, and Haman makes his debut. Right. And notice, again, the Holocaust imagery. If you look at the center panel, right, you see Haman, right, this vicious wolf that is pushing the Jews, right, the armbands, right, the Magen David, the armbands, and, right, you see, right, the Jews go, Arbeit macht frei, right. Eliyahu Sidi, it wouldn't surprise you to know, right, he is a survivor of the Shoah, right, and so he's taking the themes of Megillat Esther from Persia, right, and making them relevant, powerfully relevant, right, to the Jews of his own day. Right, Haman schemes and Mordechai mourns. Right, there we are. Right, there's Haman making his deal with Achashverosh. Right, Esther intervenes. Achashverosh honors a hero. Right, Haman envisions himself on the horse being honored, and yet the tables are turned. Instead of Haman, it is Mordechai who is sitting atop of the horse, and Haman bringing Mordechai forward. And then, of course, Haman meeting his end. There he is, right in the midst of his hanging. Right, incredibly vivid, playful images, right, bringing the Megillah alive for our own day. And of course, the mitzvot of Purim that we see here, right? Mishloach manot ish l're'ehu, giving gifts, right, to family and friends. Matanot le'evyonim, giving gifts to the poor, right? The reading of Megillat Esther, and of course, feasting. Right, and then, right, Viva el Rey, long live the king, Achashverosh at the top, right? And the close of Eliyahu Sidi's Megillat Esther. Right, so as I wrap up, I want to say that the very nature of Megillat Esther is that it is playful, it is fanciful, that it turns reality upside down, and really pushes us to think out of the box in very, very creative ways. It opens the floodgates to both exegetical and artistic creativity throughout the ages. What I love so much about the images that we've seen over the past 20 minutes is that this is visual midrash in a very, very powerful way. And it complements the philological midrash, right, that was taught so beautifully by David Frankel and Gila Wachman. It enriches our understanding of the text, and in so many ways, as David began with this archaeological dig of sorts, as we tried getting to the original text of Megillat Esther, this archaeological dig can go on so many levels, even in a creative and artistic level. I'll share one other very, very special piece with you as I close, and that is many, many moons ago when I was a student at Machon Schechter in my JTS rabbinical days, I had the privilege of becoming a sofer. And I decided that instead of purchasing my own Megillat Esther, I wanted to learn how to write so that I could create a Megillat Esther. And so over the course of my year at Schechter, I trained to be a sofer. And here is my own Megillah, which I have the privilege of reading from every year. Let me just try to make it a bit clearer so that you can see it. Here we are. Okay. I haven't had the courage to illuminate my Megillat Esther yet, but I'm working on it. So maybe by next year I'll begin that
Very
process.
impressive, Matt. Very nice.
This is
Maybe you can do copper engravings on the side.
There you go. In all of my free time, Rabbi Galinkin. So I want to wish you all Chag Purim Sameach. Have a very, very wonderful and meaningful Purim this year. And please, God, may it bring joy and peace to Am Yisrael. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi Matt. I want to conclude with two things. First of all, Josh put in the chat Rabbi Benji Siegel's commentary on Esther, which was published by Geffen Publishing and Schechter last year. You can order it through Amazon or through the Geffen website. It's a wonderful commentary on the book of Esther. Rabbi Siegel in the past taught his approach to Esther on one of these Zoom sessions. And secondly, I wanted to connect Rabbi Matt's talk to Dr. Gila Wachman's talk. He showed us a picture of somebody throwing slop, something from the bathroom on Haman's head. That's actually a midrash found in the Kovetz, in the section of midrash in Masechet Megillah that Gila was teaching from. It's from Megillah Tet Zayin Amud Aleph 16a. It's in Aramaic. I'm going to translate it into English. It says, as Kacha yaseh la'ish asher hamelech chafetz bikaro, so shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. When he was going on the road, Haman is, of course, leading Mordechai through the street. His daughter sees him leading Mordechai through the street from the roof. She thought that the person riding on the horse was her father, and that the person leading the horse was Mordechai. She took the atzitza de bet hakisei, the chamber pot, v'shadite aresha de abua, and she threw it on the head of her father, thinking that her father was Mordechai. Haman looks up, and the daughter looks down. She sees that it's actually her father. What happens? She jumps from the roof and dies. And that is why the verse says, Vayashav Mordechai Ashar HaMelech, that Mordechai returned to the king's gate. Ve'Haman nitchaf el beito avel v'chafui rosh. And Haman went back to his house, avel, mourning, with his head covered. Avel al bito v'chafui rosh al she'iralo. He was mourning for his daughter, and he was embarrassed about what had happened on him. In other words, and I have here a picture from the Encyclopedia Judaica, This is taken from a book in Polish, Krakow, 1908. And there's a mistake in the caption. It says Haman leading Mordechai through the streets of Shushan. Haman's wife mistaking him for Mordechai dumps slop on him. That is a mistake. It is Haman's daughter dumping slop on him. So apparently this was a common motif in illustrated Megillot, and we'll have to look for more Megillot with this motif, but the motif is taken straight from Masechet Megillah, folio 16a. So we have managed to tie Rabbi Matt's talk with Dr. Gila's talk into the same lesson. So we will conclude. Toda Rabba to our three lecturers, Professor David Frankel, Dr. Gila Wachman, Rabbi Matt Berkowitz. Thank you, Josh Schumann, as always, for organizing these wonderful shiurim. And we hope to see you in about a month before Pesach. In the meantime, La Yudim Haita Ora V'Simcha V'Sason V'Ikar Ken Tia Lanu. And the Jews had much joy and rejoicing. Ken Tia Lanu, so shall it be with us. Chag Purim Sameach.
Thank you.